There are moments in your life that exist in slow motion, even as they're happening. Moments where you know, with a certainty that settles deep in your chest, that everything is about to change. This was one of them. The living room was dark except for the blue glow from the television, where some late-night movie played its forgotten dialogue to an audience of two. I was curled on my side at one end of the couch, my knees drawn up slightly, eyes closed, breathing slow and deliberate, pretending to sleep. It was easier than acknowledging what was happening between us, easier than admitting I could feel the weight of Nathaniel's attention from the other end of the couch, like a physical presence. The refrigerator hummed its steady rhythm from the kitchen. Outside, Denver was quiet under a blanket of February snow, the kind of silence that only comes in the deepest part of winter nights. Inside, the air felt charged with all the things we weren't saying, all the careful distance we'd been maintaining for months, maybe years. I heard the leather cushions shift, felt the subtle give of the couch as Nathaniel moved. My heartbeat quickened, but I kept my breathing steady, kept my eyes closed. I was 34 years old, and I was still pretending to sleep to avoid facing the truth of what I wanted. The movement stopped, then started again, slower this time, more deliberate. The couch dipped as he shifted closer, and suddenly there was warmth beside me where there had been empty space. The blanket I'd been using alone was gently pulled wider, expanded to cover both of us. I felt the careful brush of his fingers as he arranged it, making sure not to wake me, making sure I was covered. Then his arm came around me, slowly, like he was giving me every opportunity to pull away, to wake up, to stop this before it became something we couldn't take back. His arm was trembling slightly as it settled around my waist, protective and terrified all at once. I could feel the warmth of his chest against my back, the careful way he was breathing, like he was afraid any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was happening between us. "This stays between us," he whispered into the dark space behind my ear. His voice was so quiet I almost wasn't sure I'd heard it. Almost. But the words settled into my chest like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples I could feel in every part of me. I didn't respond. Not with words. What could I have said? That I'd been waiting for this moment for longer than I was willing to admit? That I'd dreamed of it and woken up feeling guilty and confused? That the careful boundaries of our friendship had been slowly dissolving for months, leaving something raw and undeniable in their place? Instead, I let myself sink back against him just slightly, the smallest possible acknowledgement that I was awake, that I was choosing this too. His breath caught, and his arm tightened around me almost imperceptibly. We lay there as the movie continued its forgotten narrative, as the night crept toward morning, as everything between us shifted into something new and terrifying and inevitable. This wasn't the first time we'd found ourselves in confusing territory. There had been other moments over the years, other instances where the line between friendship and something deeper had blurred. But this felt different. This felt like crossing a bridge we couldn't uncross. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my back, could feel the way his breathing gradually slowed as the hours passed. Dawn was beginning to creep beneath the curtains, painting the room in soft gray light, but neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We just held on to this moment. This quiet admission of something we'd both been carrying alone. Later, I would replay this night endlessly. I would wonder if it meant what I thought it meant, if the trembling in his arm was fear or desire or both. I would question every breath, every shift, every second of silence. But in that moment, lying there in the blue-gray light of early morning, I knew only one thing for certain. Everything had changed. That morning, Nathaniel left before I was fully awake. I heard the soft click of the front door, the careful way he gathered his keys without letting them jingle. When I opened my eyes, the couch still held the impression of where he'd been, and the blanket smelled faintly of his cologne mixed with something else, something warmer and more familiar. I live alone in a condo in suburban Denver, 20 minutes from downtown if the traffic cooperates. I bought it 3 years ago, after my promotion at the marketing agency, where I spend my days crafting campaigns for companies that sell things people don't really need. The condo came with white walls and generic fixtures, but I've tried to make it feel like home. Mismatched coffee mugs I've collected over the years sit in my kitchen cabinets. Abstract prints that caught my eye at local galleries hang slightly crooked on my walls. Succulents line my windowsills, somehow managing to thrive despite my sporadic attention. To most people, I probably look like someone who has figured things out. I'm Julian Clark, 34, reliable, organized. I go to brunch with coworkers on Sundays, call my mother every week to check in, read poetry late at night when sleep refuses to come. I have a savings account and a mortgage and plants that stay alive. From the outside, it looks like a life built with intention. But there's something missing, something I've never been able to name or fix. A distance I maintain even from myself, a life lived just one step removed from authentic. I came out when I was 27, quietly, without fanfare. Told my parents over dinner at a restaurant where the music was loud enough to absorb any uncomfortable silences. They took it well, better than I'd expected, but I could see the careful way they processed the information, the slight recalibration they had to make. Since then, my relationships have been fleeting things. Gentle men who lasted a few months before we both realized we were going through the motions. Coffee dates that turned into dinner dates that turned into sleepovers that never quite turned into anything real. I always held something back, always kept one foot positioned toward the exit, especially when it came to Nathaniel. Nathaniel Weston has been my best friend since college, though calling him my best friend feels inadequate for what we actually are to each other. We met freshman year at the University of Colorado, two kids from different worlds who somehow found each other in the chaos of dormitory life. He was studying construction management. I was majoring in communications. He had a laugh that could fill a room and draw people to him like gravity. I was quieter, more careful, but something about his easy confidence made me braver. He's a contractor now, runs his own small company that specializes in custom home renovations. His hands are always slightly stained with wood stain or paint, permanently marked by his work in a way that I've always envied. He's married to Audrey, has been for 8 years. They have 2 kids, Emma and Sam, 7 and 5 respectively. Audrey is smart and observant in ways that sometimes make me uncomfortable, like she can see through the careful performance of normal friendship that Nathaniel and I have perfected over the years. Our friendship has always existed in a space that felt larger than the word friendship could contain. Long car rides where we'd drive for hours without a destination, just talking or sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Weekend projects where he'd show up at my place with tools and a plan to fix something I didn't even know was broken. Shared silences that felt more intimate than most conversations I'd had with people I was supposedly dating. There was the cross-country road trip we took this summer after graduation, just the 2 of us in a beat-up Honda Civic loaded with camping gear and questionable snacks. We drove from Denver to the Pacific Coast, sleeping in cheap motels and sometimes under the stars when we couldn't afford another night's lodging. Somewhere in Nevada, around 3 in the morning, we'd pulled over to look at the sky, and Nathaniel had said he'd never felt more free in his life. The way he looked at me when he said it made something flutter in my chest that I immediately pushed down. Then there was Vegas, 2 years ago. A bachelor party for a mutual friend that somehow ended with just the 2 of us in a hotel room after everyone else had either passed out or found other entertainment. We'd shared a bed because the room only had one, and I'd lain awake most of the night listening to him breathe, feeling the careful space between us like a live wire. Nothing happened. At least, that's what I told myself then, and what I continued telling myself until that night on my couch, when everything shifted. But the truth I'd been avoiding was that something had been happening between us for years. In the way he'd show up at my place when he'd had a fight with Audrey, never saying what the fight was about, but needing somewhere safe to land. In the way I'd find excuses to text him throughout the day, sharing articles or jokes or nothing at all, just wanting the connection. In the way we'd gravitated toward each other at parties, forming our own quiet bubble even in crowded rooms. We'd built our entire adult lives around each other while pretending we were just friends, and now, sitting in my living room with the morning light revealing the truth of what had happened between us, I finally understood how unsustainable that had become. 3 weeks after that night on my couch, Nathaniel called with an idea. A cabin trip, he said, just like the old days. 4 of us, all college friends. Mike and Derek, who we'd barely seen since someone's wedding 2 years ago, and us. One long weekend in the mountains, away from everything. I almost said no. The careful equilibrium we'd found since that morning felt fragile, and I wasn't sure I trusted myself to maintain it in close quarters for 3 days. But there was something in his voice when he said he needed a break from real life, something that sounded almost desperate beneath his usual easy confidence. So I said yes, and tried not to think too hard about what that meant. The cabin sat 40 minutes outside of Vail, nestled in a grove of pine trees that looked like something from a postcard. It was snowing when we arrived, fat flakes that caught in the headlight beams and turned the world soft and muffled. The air smelled like winter and wood smoke from other cabins scattered throughout the valley. Our breath formed clouds as we hauled our bags from the cars, laughing at how unprepared we were for the altitude and the cold. Inside, the cabin was exactly what you'd expect from a rental property trying to evoke rustic charm. Knotty pine walls, a stone fireplace that dominated the main room, furniture that was sturdy but not quite comfortable. The whole place smelled like cedar and whiskey, as if previous guests had soaked the walls with their good intentions and poor decisions. The firewood was damp from sitting outside too long, and it took us 20 minutes of coaxing to get a decent fire started. The first 2 nights fell into the rhythm of middle-aged men pretending to be 22 again. Beer and card games that went later than they should have. Stories about jobs and mortgages and the small disappointments of adult life. Mike complained about his wife's spending habits while Derek showed us pictures of his 6-month-old daughter with the devotion of a new parent. Nathaniel talked about a big renovation project that was running behind schedule, but not about Audrey, not about home. I mostly listened, content to be the audience for their performances of contentment. But underneath the easy camaraderie, I could feel Nathaniel's attention like a current in the room. The way he'd look at me when he thought no one else was watching. The way he'd position himself near me during conversations. Close enough that I could smell his cologne and the beer on his breath. Close enough that our shoulders would brush when we reached for the same bowl of pretzels. On Sunday morning, everything changed. Mike got a call from his wife. His daughter had fallen off her bike and needed stitches. Derek's babysitter had canceled, leaving his wife alone with a teething infant and no backup plan. Within an hour, they were both packing their cars and apologizing for cutting the weekend short. Family emergencies, they said, but I wondered if they could sense the tension that had been building between Nathaniel and me, if they were giving us space we hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Suddenly, it was just the 2 of us in a cabin that felt much smaller than it had with 4 people filling it. We spent the afternoon cleaning up, washing dishes and folding blankets, moving around each other in the small kitchen with the careful choreography of people trying not to touch. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. That evening, we sat in front of the fireplace with the last of the beer. The snow had stopped, leaving the world outside pristine and impossibly quiet. Nathaniel had been drinking steadily since the others left, not drunk, but looser than usual, his usual careful control starting to fray around the edges. I nursed a single beer, knowing I needed to stay alert, needed to be ready for whatever was about to happen between us. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Our chairs were positioned at angles that should have felt casual, but every time I glanced over at him, I found him already looking at me. The space between us felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. He was telling me about work, about a client who kept changing their mind about cabinet hardware, when his hand moved to the armrest of his chair. Just a casual gesture, except that his fingers brushed against mine where my own hand rested. Just for a second, just a whisper of contact, but it sent electricity shooting up my arm. Neither of us moved our hands away. The conversation faltered. He stared into the fire for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more careful. He told me about his father, who'd been hard in ways that went beyond strict parenting. About childhood memories that explained why he'd learned early to hide parts of himself, to be what people expected rather than what he was. He talked about closets, about the games he'd played as a kid, hiding not just from his siblings, but from truths he wasn't ready to name. I listened without interrupting, understanding that he was telling me something important, something he'd never said out loud before. The fire cast shifting shadows across his face, and in those shadows I could see the boy he'd been, scared and careful and already learning to disappear. When he finished talking, the silence that followed felt different, heavier, full of recognition and possibility and terror. We sat there as the fire burned lower, as the cabin settled around us, as the snow began to fall again outside the windows. Neither of us moved to go to bed. Neither of us suggested we should probably get some sleep. Instead, we just sat there, our hands still touching on the armrest between our chairs, breathing in the space between one truth and another. That night at the cabin, after the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the silence had stretched to its breaking point, something finally gave way between us. Not all at once, not dramatically, but like a dam developing a crack that would eventually change the course of a river. We'd moved from our chairs to the couch, drawn together by some gravitational pull we'd both stopped pretending to resist. The pretense of sleep came later, back in my living room 3 weeks earlier, but that night in the mountains was when the foundation shifted. When Nathaniel's arm came around me as we lay in the flickering darkness, when he whispered those words that would echo in my head for months afterward. This stays between us. But the way he said it, the tremor in his voice, made it sound less like a promise and more like a question. The drive back to Denver the next morning was quiet in a way that felt loaded. We talked about safe things. The weather, the traffic, whether we should stop for gas. But underneath it all was the weight of what had happened, what we'd let happen, what it might mean. When he dropped me off at my condo, he didn't get out of the car, just gave me a smile that looked like an apology and said he'd talk to me soon. Soon turned into days, then a week, then 2 weeks with only the most basic text exchanges. Thanks for the weekend. Hope work is going well. The kind of messages you send to acquaintances, not to someone who'd held you in the dark while you both pretended the world wasn't shifting beneath you. I obsessed over every detail of that night. The way his breathing had changed when I'd settled back against him. The careful pressure of his arm across my chest. The minutes that had passed before he'd whispered those words, as if he'd been working up the courage or trying to talk himself out of it. I replayed the moment until it started to feel like something I'd imagined, a fiction I'd constructed to explain the ache in my chest every time my phone didn't ring. I tried to move forward, tried to pretend that whatever had happened between us was just a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by too much beer and the strange intimacy of mountain air. I went back to my regular routines. Work, gym, the occasional dinner with friends who didn't know to ask about Nathaniel. I even downloaded a dating app for the first time in months, swiping through faces of men who seemed perfectly nice and utterly incapable of filling the space Nathaniel had carved out in my chest. I met Caleb at a coffee shop near my office. He was a graphic designer, soft-spoken and kind, with dark hair and an easy laugh. Under normal circumstances, he was exactly the type of person I'd be interested in. We had dinner, then another dinner, then drinks that turned into him staying over at my place. He was sweet and attentive, and I felt terrible for how distracted I was throughout all of it. Even when he was kissing me, even when we were tangled together in my bed, part of me was somewhere else, wondering what Nathaniel was doing, whether he was thinking about me too. After 3 weeks of trying to make something work with Caleb, I finally admitted to both of us that my heart wasn't in it. He took it better than I deserved, said he'd sensed I was dealing with something and hoped I figured it out. The kindness in his voice made me feel even worse about the whole thing. Then Nathaniel started texting again. Nothing dramatic, just an invitation to help him build a deck in his backyard. Normal friend behavior, the kind of weekend project we'd done dozens of times before. I almost said no, but something in me needed to see if we could still exist in the same space, if we could pretend nothing had changed. The day was bright and warm, one of those perfect Colorado spring afternoons that makes you understand why people move here. Nathaniel had already framed most of the deck, and we spent the morning measuring and cutting boards, working with the easy rhythm we'd developed over years of similar projects. But something was different. The silences stretched longer than they used to. Eye contact lasted a beat too long before one of us would look away. Jokes came slower, if they came at all. Audrey brought us lunch around noon, sandwiches and lemonade served on paper plates. She was friendly but watchful, and I caught her studying both of us with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. When Nathaniel went inside to use the bathroom, she lingered by the deck, making conversation about the weather and the neighbors, but I could feel her real attention focused on something else entirely. That afternoon, as we were cleaning up the tools, Nathaniel seemed to be moving slower than necessary, as if he was trying to delay the end of our time together. When I finally said I should probably head home, he nodded but didn't quite meet my eyes. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was making dinner. Audrey's name on the screen made my stomach drop. She'd never called me before, not once in all the years I'd known her. We'd texted about logistics, coordinating surprise parties, or group dinners, but never an actual phone call. When I answered, her voice was careful, measured. She said she was worried about Nathaniel. He'd been moody lately, distracted. When she asked what was wrong, he insisted nothing was, but she'd been married to him long enough to know better. She didn't ask me directly if I knew what was going on, but the question hung in the air between us anyway. I told her I'd noticed he seemed a little off, but didn't know why. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. She thanked me for listening and asked if I could maybe reach out to him, see if he'd talk to me about whatever was bothering him. The irony of her asking me to help fix a problem I was probably at least partially responsible for wasn't lost on me. A week passed before I worked up the courage to call him. When I did, he sounded genuinely happy to hear from me, which somehow made everything worse. We talked about nothing important for a few minutes before he mentioned that one of his kitchen drawers was sticking and asked if I might come over to help him fix it. It was clearly an excuse to see each other, and we both knew it, but I said yes anyway. His house was quiet when I arrived. Audrey had taken the kids to her mother's for the evening, he explained, giving us space to work without little hands trying to help. The kitchen drawer was indeed sticking, warped from years of Colorado's dry air, but it was a 15-minute fix at most. We both knew that, and we both pretended we didn't. After I'd adjusted the tracks and tested the drawer a few times, we found ourselves sitting on the kitchen floor with our backs against the cabinets, listening to music that played softly from his phone. It was an old playlist, songs from college that brought back memories of late nights in dorm rooms and road trips when the future felt infinite and uncomplicated. Nathaniel had his head tilted back against the cabinet door, eyes closed, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. The late afternoon light slanted through the window above the sink, casting everything in golden tones that made the moment feel suspended, separate from real time. "I think I messed up," he said quietly, without opening his eyes. "But I don't know what I messed up." His voice was so soft I almost wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. I waited for him to say more, to explain what he meant, but he just sat there with his eyes closed and his face turned toward the ceiling, as if he was hoping the answer might be written there. I wanted to tell him he hadn't messed up anything, that whatever was happening between us wasn't his fault alone. I wanted to say that I'd been carrying the same confusion, the same sense that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But the words stuck in my throat, trapped behind years of careful distance, and the fear that saying them out loud would make everything real in a way we couldn't take back. So I just sat there beside him on the kitchen floor, listening to music that reminded us both of simpler times, letting the silence hold everything we couldn't say. But we were closer now than we'd been since that night at the cabin. Close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Close enough that when he finally opened his eyes and looked at me, I could see something raw and uncertain swimming in their depths. We didn't talk about the cabin that night. We didn't talk about the way everything had shifted between us, or what it might mean for his marriage, or our friendship, or the carefully constructed lives we'd both built around this unspoken thing between us. But we orbited around it, drawn by the same gravity that had been pulling us together for years. Only now we were close enough to feel the heat. 2 weeks after that evening on his kitchen floor, Nathaniel appeared at my door unannounced. It was late on a Thursday night, nearly 10 o'clock, and Denver was being lashed by one of those sudden spring storms that turn the air electric and make you feel like the world might crack open at any moment. Through the peephole, I could see him standing under the inadequate overhang by my front door, soaked through and shivering slightly. When I opened the door, he looked like he'd been walking in the rain for hours. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his jacket darkened with water, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not quite panic, but close. Something wild and desperate that made my chest tighten with concern. "Come in," I said, stepping aside without asking what he was doing there or why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He moved past me into the warm light of my living room, leaving wet footprints on the hardwood, and I could see him taking in the familiar space as if he was seeing it for the first time. I brought him a towel from the bathroom, and he dried his hair with mechanical movements, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. The rain drummed against the windows with increasing intensity, punctuated by the occasional rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the building's foundation. I made tea, more for something to do with my hands than because either of us wanted it, and we sat on opposite ends of the couch with the steaming mugs between us like a barrier. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched and deepened, filled only by the sound of the storm outside and the soft hum of the heater kicking on. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, noting the way his shoulders held tension, the way his hands wrapped around the mug without actually drinking from it. He was building up to something, I could tell, gathering courage or trying to find the right words for whatever had driven him through the rain to my door. Finally, he set down his mug and looked directly at me for the first time since he'd arrived. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I had a dream about you. Last night." The words hung in the air between us like a confession. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain what the dream had been about or why it had shaken him enough to bring him here in the middle of a thunderstorm. But I could see in his face that whatever he dreamed had stripped away another layer of the careful distance we'd been maintaining. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it over the rain. This was the moment I'd been both hoping for and dreading for months, maybe years. The moment when one of us would finally say something that couldn't be taken back or explained away as friendship or misunderstanding. The question that had been living in my chest, growing heavier with each passing day, finally found its way to my lips. I looked at him sitting there in my living room, vulnerable and scared and more beautiful than I'd ever allowed myself to acknowledge, and I asked the thing I'd been afraid to ask for longer than I cared to admit. "Are you in love with me?" The words came out steadier than I'd expected, clear and direct in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. For a moment, he just stared at me, and I could see something shifting in his expression, like walls he'd spent years building were finally starting to crumble. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved closer on the couch, close enough that I could smell the rain in his hair and see the uncertainty swimming in his eyes. Then he leaned forward, not for a kiss, but something more tentative, more profound. His forehead came to rest against my shoulder, and I felt the weight of him settling into that small point of contact like he was finally allowing himself to be held. "I don't know what to do with it," he whispered into the space between my shoulder and my neck, his voice muffled but unmistakably honest. The admission hung in the air like a prayer or a plea, and I closed my eyes against the rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm me. I was terrified and relieved in equal measure. Terrified because this was real now, because we'd finally named the thing that had been growing between us for years. Relieved because I wasn't alone in it anymore, because the longing I'd been carrying wasn't one-sided after all. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, him leaning into me and me holding perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the spell and send him running back out into the storm. The rain continued its assault on the windows, but inside my living room, everything felt suspended, caught between what we'd been and what we might become. Eventually, exhaustion took over. We arranged ourselves on the couch the way we had that night at the cabin, but this time we were facing each other, close enough that I could feel his breath on my face and count the flecks of gold in his eyes. This time, there was no pretense of sleep, no careful positioning to avoid acknowledging what was happening. We looked at each other in the dim light from the street lamps filtering through the rain-streaked windows, and I saw my own wonder and fear reflected back in his expression. When I woke the next morning, he was still there, still close enough to touch, but somehow farther away than he'd been in the darkness. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside scrubbed clean and bright with morning light. We lay there for a few minutes, both of us awake, but neither willing to be the first to move, to break whatever fragile thing we'd created in the night. Nothing had been resolved. We hadn't talked about his marriage or what any of this meant for the carefully constructed lives we'd both built. We hadn't made any promises or plans or declarations beyond that whispered admission in the dark. But nothing was hidden anymore. The question had been asked and answered, not with words, but with the simple act of him staying, of choosing to spend the night curled toward me instead of running back to the safety of pretense and distance. Everything between us had changed again, and this time, there was no going back. The invitation came 3 days after that morning when we'd finally stopped hiding from each other. A text from Nathaniel, casual and brief. Family barbecue Saturday. You should come. As if nothing monumental had shifted between us. As if we were still the same people we'd been before that rainstorm night. I almost said no. The thought of sitting in their backyard, making conversation with Audrey while pretending I hadn't spent the night holding her husband, felt impossible. But there was something in the invitation that felt like a test, or maybe a dare. So I said yes and spent the next 2 days trying to convince myself I could handle whatever was coming. Their backyard was perfect for entertaining, with a deck Nathaniel had built himself and gardens that Audrey tended with the same careful attention she brought to everything else in her life. The afternoon was warm and bright, filled with the laughter of Emma and Sam playing with neighborhood kids and the easy conversation of adults who'd known each other for years. I brought a bottle of wine and fell into the familiar rhythm of these gatherings, talking to other parents about school policies and summer vacation plans, helping Nathaniel with the grill, playing catch with the kids when they demanded an audience for their latest athletic achievements. On the surface, everything looked normal. But underneath, I could feel the weight of Audrey's attention every time I moved through her carefully orchestrated world. She was watching us. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but with the focused awareness of someone trying to solve a puzzle she'd been working on for months. When Nathaniel and I stood near each other, when we fell into our usual easy conversation, when he handed me a beer with a smile that lasted just a beat too long, I could feel her cataloging every interaction, every glance, every moment of connection. The confrontation came while I was helping clear plates from the patio table. She followed me into the kitchen, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow felt final. The sudden quiet after the noise of the party was jarring, and when I turned to face her, I could see she'd been preparing for this conversation. She didn't waste time with small talk or careful lead-ins. Just looked at me across her kitchen island, her expression calm but determined, and asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you love him? The directness of it took my breath away. No accusations, no anger, just a simple question that cut straight to the heart of everything. I stood there holding a stack of paper plates, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, and realized I couldn't lie to her. Not about this. Not when she was looking at me with such clear, unflinching honesty. Yes, I said. The word came out quietly but without hesitation, and I watched something settle in her expression, as if she'd been waiting for confirmation of something she'd already known. She nodded, a small, sad movement that somehow contained years of understanding. She didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't demand explanations or apologies. Just stood there in her beautiful kitchen, surrounded by the life she'd built with the man I'd just admitted to loving, and said 4 words that broke my heart. I thought so. We didn't talk about what it meant, what she was going to do with this information, whether she'd known before that moment or had just been waiting for someone to say it out loud. She just took the plates from my hands and thanked me for helping, and I walked back out to the party feeling like I'd been turned inside out. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I stayed until it would have been rude to leave earlier, making conversation and helping with cleanup while trying not to think about the quiet devastation I'd seen in Audrey's eyes. When I finally said my goodbyes, Nathaniel walked me to my car, and I could see questions in his face that I couldn't begin to answer. 4 days later, he showed up at my door again. But this time was different. This time, he looked like someone who'd made a decision that had cost him everything. The first thing I noticed was his hands. Specifically, his left hand, where the gold band he'd worn for 8 years was conspicuously absent. Just a pale line of skin that looked vulnerable and strange, like evidence of something that had been torn away. We sat on my couch, the same place where so much between us had been revealed and acknowledged, but this time the conversation was different, clearer, more honest than either of us had ever dared to be. He talked about the years he'd spent burying parts of himself, tucking away desires and feelings that didn't fit the life he'd thought he was supposed to want. About how he'd convinced himself that love was about choosing the right path rather than following your heart. About the way I'd always felt like home to him, even when he'd been too afraid to acknowledge what that meant. I listened as he described the conversation he'd had with Audrey, how she'd told him she'd seen this coming for longer than he'd realized, how they'd sat at their kitchen table and carefully dismantled a marriage that had been held together more by habit and hope than by the kind of love either of them deserved. When he finished talking, the silence between us felt different than all the others we'd shared. Not heavy with unspoken things, but clear and open, like we'd finally found our way to solid ground. I told him I didn't want to be someone's escape, someone's midlife crisis or moment of rebellion. That I'd waited too long and felt too much to settle for being the reason someone left their life, rather than being the life they chose to build. He looked at me with those eyes that had been seeing me more clearly than I'd been willing to admit for years, and said he didn't want to be someone's secret anymore. That he was tired of living in the spaces between what he wanted and what he thought he was supposed to want. We sat with that truth between us, painful but finally clear. Everything had a cost, and we were both old enough to understand that choosing each other meant choosing to rebuild rather than pretend. It meant accepting that love sometimes requires you to break things before you can put them back together in a way that actually works. The conversation lasted until dawn, and when the sun came up through my living room windows, we were still there, still talking, still choosing each other despite the complicated mess it would make of everything we'd built separately. 6 months later, I was walking through a used bookstore downtown when I found it. Leaves of grass, the spine cracked and pages soft with age, tucked between a cookbook and a guide to Colorado hiking trails. Something made me pull it from the shelf, maybe the familiar weight of Whitman's words, or maybe just the need to hold something that felt substantial and real. When I opened the cover, a postcard fell out. Nothing fancy, just a generic image of the Rocky Mountains at sunset, the kind tourists buy at gas stations. But when I turned it over, I recognized the handwriting immediately, that careful script I'd seen on grocery lists and birthday cards for more than a decade. This stays between us, it read, or maybe it doesn't have to. The signature was just an N, but I would have known who wrote it even without that small confirmation. I bought the book and carried it home with a strange lightness in my chest, as if I were carrying a message I'd been waiting years to receive. The months since that dawn conversation had been complicated in ways I'd expected and simple in ways that had surprised me. There had been lawyers and difficult conversations with children who didn't understand why Daddy was moving out. There had been family dinners that ended in tears and friends who took sides without being asked to choose. But there had also been text messages that no longer needed to be carefully neutral. Phone calls that lasted hours and didn't end with awkward goodbyes. Dinners at my place where we could sit close enough to touch without checking first to make sure no one was watching. Nathaniel had moved into a small apartment across town, close enough to his kids that he could still help with homework and Saturday morning soccer games. We'd been careful not to rush anything, understanding that the foundation we were building needed to be solid enough to support not just us, but the wider circle of people our choices had affected. The knock came just after 9 that night. 3 soft taps that I somehow knew belonged to him before I even looked through the peephole. When I opened the door, he was standing there with a suitcase in one hand and keys in the other, looking nervous in a way that reminded me of the college boy I'd first fallen for all those years ago. There was no dramatic music, no kiss in the rain like something out of a movie. Just the quiet click of the lock as I stepped aside to let him in. Just the familiar sound of his keys hitting the table by my front door, where they'd landed dozens of times before during visits that always had an endpoint. We didn't need to discuss what the suitcase meant or why he'd finally decided to stop living in the space between one life and another. The past 6 months had been a slow negotiation toward this moment, a careful process of learning how to choose each other not just in moments of crisis or revelation, but in the ordinary decisions that make up a life. I made tea while he settled his things, both of us moving through the routine with the easy familiarity of people who'd been practicing this dance for years without admitting that's what they were doing. When I came back from the kitchen, he was sitting on the couch, the same spot where we'd held each other through so many nights of uncertainty and hope. I sat down next to him, closer than we'd ever allowed ourselves to sit, when this was still my place, and his was somewhere else. Close enough that our shoulders touched, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him settling into the space beside me like he belonged there. He reached for my hand, threading our fingers together with the kind of care you reserve for precious things, fragile things, things you've waited too long to touch. His wedding ring was gone, had been for months now, but there was a new callus on his finger from the construction work he'd been throwing himself into, building other people's dreams while he figured out how to construct his own. We sat there in the quiet of my living room, listening to the familiar sounds of the buildings settling around us, the distant hum of traffic, the soft whisper of air through the heating vents. All the same sounds that had formed the soundtrack to our friendship for years, but now they felt different, like the beginning of something rather than the space between other things. I thought about that night at the cabin, about the careful way we'd approached each other across years of almost, and not quite, and someday maybe. About all the conversations we'd had in code, all the feelings we'd buried under the safer language of friendship. About the way love sometimes requires you to be braver than you thought possible, to choose truth over comfort, to build something new instead of protecting something that was never quite right. This stays between us, he'd written on that postcard. But sitting there with his hand in mine, in the home we were finally ready to share, I understood that he'd been wrong. This didn't have to stay between us anymore. This could be the thing we chose in front of everyone, the love we built in daylight instead of protecting in shadows. Outside, Denver continued its familiar rhythms, but inside, everything was finally exactly where it belonged.